I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this conference. I'm really delighted to be here to present some of my knowledge on brain-machine intelligence. I actually changed a little bit the title because I realized that maybe most of you don't really know about the basics of brain-computer interfaces. So let me give you maybe more theory and more general vision on what's going on in the world. So yeah, a little bit about myself. I did a PhD in computer science on brain-computer interfaces in France, and then I worked on virtual reality and physiological signals other than the brain in Israel. And currently, I'm an associate professor at the computing faculty, where I teach brain-computer interfaces, new courses, brain-computer interfaces, physiological computing, and robotics. Okay, so just to give you, I will move so that you can see. So just to give you an overview of what's going on in the world, these ongoing projects on the brain. So first of all, there's connectomics, which they try to create a 3D roadmap of the brain. So in a cellular in a nano scale, and they're trying to reconstruct this brain and to understand through structure its functionality. The other project is Brainbow. So they're genetically modifying the brain, so in the embryo, so that when the neurons grow, they will grow in different color. They won't be gray or white matter, so they will be easily differentiated. Other field is called optogenetics, and this field is about genetically modifying the brain again so that it becomes sensitive to light. Naturally, it's not sensitive to light, only our retina is sensitive to light. So they're modifying the brain so that they can influence different parts of the brain via light, via photo. Okay, so other projects on the brain, they include computer simulations of the brain and computer models of the brain. And the last one that I will be talking about that I'm working on is brain-computer or brain-machine interfaces, where this is a system that enables us to interact with the machine via only neural activity. So I'll talk about that. I'll talk about these present ongoing studies that we've been doing in brain-computer interfaces. Yeah, this is a typo. It's a bridge between the brain and the machine. Sorry about that. It's not machine and computer. But if you look at the brain as a machine, but yeah, let's not go there. So this is the present, and I will go back to the past, and I will talk about how machine intelligence draws inspiration from these computational models of the brain. And the typical example, the most known example, is the artificial neural networks. And then lastly, I will talk about the future. I'm not the only one. So many scientists in the field, they think that if we include the emotional intelligence, that we can reach the next level of machine intelligence. So if the machine has also this emotional intelligence. I'll talk about that. Okay, so let's start with this. The first, let's start with the definition. It's more a clinical definition. So it's a system that measures neural activity, converts it into artificial output that replaces, restores, enhances, supplements, or improves natural neural output, and thereby changes the ongoing interactions between the central nervous system and its external and internal environment. What this means is basically the central nervous system, we interact with the outside world, and we also, the brain interacts with our internal organs. And what we do with brain-computer interfaces is we're extending the boundaries of the central nervous system by, for example, adding additional limbs, and our brain is directly, let's say, manipulating this additional limb. And in that way, it's kind of like we're extending our central nervous system outside of our own limitations of our own body. So this is like another limb of ours. Maybe another more simple definition is that this is a system as a type of human-computer interaction that changes in real time. It reacts, and it uses neural impulses as input data, displays a perceptual events at the output. So it's used in medicine, in medical applications, in psychotherapy, in art, gaming, and so on. It's not yet so much commercialized, but it's probably going there. Let's talk about the principles. So first of all, we need to measure brain activity. So imagine we place EEG, just electrodes on the brain. And what happens is we're not injecting any current. We're just measuring what's naturally there in the brain. There's electrical current in the brain, so we're measuring that with EEG, for example. And then, yeah, and then we are filtering this data, these signals. And how we filter it, well, for example, imagine a person imagines to move their left or right hand. So they're just imagining to move. And this creates a signal in a certain frequency range. This frequency range is, for example, between 16 and 30 hertz. And so we know this from neurobiology and neuroscience. We know this, and we can filter out all of these other signals as noise. Okay? This is a very simplified way of telling you, but this is how we kind of process this data. Okay? So we process it, filter it, and then, and then we use machine learning. Why? Because each person is different. Their brain morphology is completely different, and their signal is different. So machine needs to train. The machine needs to learn on each person individually. So there's this training, calibration data. And it receives this data from the user, this EEG data. And this calibration typically lasts around 10 minutes. It can be less or more. But yeah, and we typically use like very simple algorithms, classification algorithms like LDA or SVM. Why? Because they don't need a lot of data to work sufficiently well. Okay, this is a real-time process. You realize, so the machine needs to react to our neural data in very real time. Okay, and then the testing. You probably all know how machine learning works. So in the testing phase, when it receives new data from the brain, it should be able to classify, for example, here the imagination of a left or right hand. So it has two commands, left or right. And then what happens is it will control the machine, for example, in a wheelchair or whatever, to go left or right. Okay. And so this error rate or success rate of this the control of the machine influences the human, because it's a real-time, it's a closed loop. It's a real-time interaction. So it influences the human, the user, in such a way that if the machine is not moving as the user is expecting, that happens, it can influence them to be frustrated. And if they're frustrated, then their EEG data will be even more, let's say, noisy. Let's just call it like that. And then the machine will have even more hard time to classify the data. So it becomes a vicious circle. So the more they're frustrated, the more they do not focus on the task at hand. Just imagine your left or right hand movement. So this is just an example. There are a lot of applications, different paradigms in BCI, but this is one typical example. And so it can be also a virtuous circle in a sense that if it works as expected, the user will be super, really motivated, and it will work even better. So it's very, very fascinating how the psychological state of the user can influence also the success. The success of, I think it's here, yeah. The success of this whole system. And so what happens is that actually not only does the machine learn, but also the human needs to learn. Because the way that you really need to focus, it's not an everyday activity that you manipulate a machine with only your brain activity. What does it mean to move your hands without moving them? Like, what does that mean? So basically, we're learning this. And while we're learning, new synapses are being created, blah, blah. A lot of things change in the brain, but the machine has trained on old data. So it will miss. Now the classification won't really work. So what we expect, we think that, okay, so the machine also needs to adapt in the same way that, ideally, the same way the brain does. Okay, so this brings me to the second topic. And the second topic, which is where we draw the inspiration for machine intelligence from the brain. So we create computational models of the brain. And the most basic one is neural networks. So let's see how this happened. Let me tell you about the past. What happened? So in 1939, there were experiments performed by Hodgkin and Huxley. They experimented on a giant squid. Why? Because it has one very large axon. And they were injecting it with some current, and they were looking at how this neuron reacts as an electrical device. And then in 1952, they created this set of beautiful differential equations for which they got the Nobel Prizes. Okay. And so let's talk about that. So if we look at the neuron as an input-output device, we can look at these. I hope that you know your basic biology. So you have these dendrites that are represented in, wait, let me see if I can just do this. Is the red dot, no, it doesn't work, the red dot. Okay, so if you have these red branches, they are dendrites, and they can represent the input of the neuron. And this input means that it receives information, electrical information, from other neurons. These other neurons, their endings, let's say, are here. They can be blue or black. And this is just, they're not blue or black in reality. It's just a representation. And their connecting points are these synapses, these like green dots, for example. And they can be, for example, excitatory or inhibitory, meaning that they can produce positive current or negative current. This is what happens in the brain, in the neuron. And in the output, the axon creates a signal. It does or it doesn't. Now we'll see how. So the Hodgkin-Huxley, they would, for example, inject a current. Let's say this is a piece of a neuron. And they would inject a current, this step current, positive current, and they would see the response of the neuron in such a way that it looks like an RC circuit. Now, for electrical engineering, maybe they understand. So this is a resistor and a capacitor. And basically, it means that, when you inject current, the voltage will rise very slowly, and then also it will diminish. So it's this RC kind of type of current. Okay, I'm not going to go into electrical. But what is interesting is that when you add this step positive current, for example, many times, this voltage doesn't have time to attenuate, but it summates in time, like any kind of analog signal. So it summates in time. It becomes a temporal summation. And why am I talking about this? Is because when it reaches a certain threshold, it will create a spike, this so-called action potential. And no matter how much it passes this threshold, it will create a spike of the same amplitude. That will appear earlier or later, but it's fantastic because it looks like it represents a digital signal. It's a 0 or 1. Why 0? Because if it doesn't pass this threshold, it will just simply attenuate. And if it passes this threshold, and no matter how much it passes, it will create the same signal, the same spike, the 0 or 1, how they call it in neuroscience. So it's very fascinating how actually the neuron can be looked at in a way, and the synapses can be looked at. Okay, so if we receive the action potential, the 0, none signal, and then what we have in a soma, we have this analog signal. So we can look at the synapses as a digital to analog converter. It's fantastic. And then in the soma, if it reaches this threshold, then the soma it actually behaves as an analog to digital. Why? Because here, either the neuron will fire something, this signal, or it won't. It will be 0. So for those who know artificial neural networks, they will notice the similarity. Now, very, very soon after Hodgkin-Huxley, they published their differential equations, a few years later, there was this perceptron, this invention of Rosenblatt. Well, invention. He created an artificial neural network. He was inspired by the neurological, the actual neuron, what happened in reality, right? And so he represented this as, okay, we have this connection, and these neurons, they can either fire or not, right? So they can send either a 1 or a 0. And these connections can be either excitatory or inhibitory, which gives, this is a very simplistic, the old, right, the version of the artificial neural networks. And so we have these weights that can be positive or negative, depending if it's excitatory or inhibitory. And we just perform a matrix, this multiplication, and we get a number. And if this number is smaller than the threshold, it's 0. If it's higher than the threshold, it's 1. That's the basic principle. And so, then I'm not going to go too much into history, but it took 25 or 30 years to actually implement and go back to the neural networks and so on. So it can create very, impressive results. For example, this image is created by an artificial neural network. I don't know if you know about Midjourney and DALL-E and so on. So these are like these vast, artificial. There's neurons that create You type in. Like I typed in waves and I don't know, electrical, blah, blah, and it created this image. So through letters or words. So yeah, it's impressive, but it needs many layers to work. It needs a lot of training data. So this means that we need a lot of really strong and big GPUs, which means we need a lot of consumption, more power consumption. And in the case of BCI, I think Valentina was talking about how changeable a warehouse can be. Imagine how changeable a brain can be. It changes so much all the time. So in BCI, we cannot really have a lot of data. Artificial neural networks cannot really work, and we don't even have enough data. Even if we collect everything, it's complicated. So these data change in time, and we need some kind of an adaptive algorithm. We need something adaptive. And what is more adaptive, again, than the brain? So, okay, let's go back to a computational model of the brain. And neuroscientists, they model the brain in this, let's say, macro level. So we had this micro level, right, from neurons. Let's think about the cognition and what happens in learning in general in this micro level. Let's do an experiment. I'll ask you, what do you see here in this image? It looks blurry, right? But what if I tell you it's a cow? Now, these are eyes, nose, and ears. So, yeah, so those of you who can see a cow, now whenever you see it next time this image, you won't not see it. It's going to be impossible not to see it, I guarantee. So you will immediately see the cow. And you learned. So you changed. Now, because thanks to your experience, you will see the cow, right? It's your brain approximates, and it learns from experience. Okay, so this is what typically we call the Bayesian brain. So to cite, let's say, contemporary neuroscientists, it says, well, the brain is closed in the skull. There's no light, there's no color, there's no sound. It only works with these electrical impulses. So with these electrical impulses, it's trying to make these approximations of the world outside. And it's trying to make these, from these perceptual events, it's creating a mental model of the world. So it maybe becomes too philosophical, but in a way you can think that we can never know about the reality that surrounds us. It's only a mental representation of the world that we have from our brain. So yeah, we're not going to philosophy here. But so let's go to Bayesian inference, how to model this mathematically. So they used, Bayesian theorem, the classical one. And they said that, the brain is constantly updating this model of the world. And it's predicting future events. Now, I'm going to try to convince you that we're not only learning from perception, we're learning also from being active in our world. And let me tell you about that. So I will mention this experiment, very known experiment, where they took 10 pairs of kittens, and they spent all of the day in the dark, except 6 hours per day. They were exposed to light, and they were exposed into this kind of a carousel structure. And one cat was walking, and it was, through this mechanism, it was carrying the other cat. Okay? So this cat was actually in control of what both of them will perceive. Okay? And so at the end of the experiment, a few months later, they released the cats, and the cats that were moving, they developed normal vision, while the cats who didn't move, they didn't develop normal vision. They developed later when they were out in the wild, and so it's okay, somewhat okay. But so yeah, my point is that we cannot have a normal perception without action, without actively performing in the world, without being active in our environment in order to choose at least what we're going to perceive. So it goes also vice versa. If, I don't know, so if you look at this image, for example, this hammer, in 1996, Gaver, he coined a term called perceptual affordance. And what he means by that is that an object, like this hammer, it affords a finite number of actions that you can perform onto it. So when you look at this hammer, you're not really aware, but if you know what it is used for, if you know what a hammer is used for from your experience, your brain will fire motor neurons in order to be already ready to perform the action. So you didn't perform the action, but your brain, they have shown that the brain is already motoring and it's preparing your hand, right hand, for example, to already perform this action. So the perception and action are actually intrinsically linked in both ways. So, and also the brain, why it does this is because it wants to optimize the time. so that you can be as efficient as possible. The brain wants you to be as efficient as possible. So it brings us to active inference, this model of the brain. Of course, no model is absolute truth. When you know that, it's a model, right, of the brain, but it can help us to understand close enough. And so what does it say? So if we implement this action, we add action to our model that we're updating in a Bayesian manner, then this action, the action that we choose is the one that will maximize the knowledge that we have from the world. We will try to extract as much knowledge that we can. And on the other hand, we want to maximize our goal. So I can go into, if you like, mathematical discussions with you later. So if you want, we can chat. But yeah, so what we want to do is we want to endow this type of intelligence that we're inspired from the brain, and to endow it to the machine. So we want the machine to have a similar way to mimic brain behavior. Okay. And we implemented this in a brain-computer interface. It made sense. Why? Because in a brain-computer interface, we want the machine to behave and to learn in an adaptive way, the same way the brain does. So what we did, these are a lot of details. Don't pay attention about that. But what is the main principle is that the machine, in order to understand what the user wants, it will perform action, and it will perform such action to be, to maximize the knowledge, to know exactly, does the user want to spell a letter or to pause or whatever they want? So because the machine would only receive EEG signal. That's the perception, this input from the world, right? That the machine has. And so in order to understand better what's going on in the world, which is the human, the user, it will perform these activities, this action, so that it can reach this knowledge and the goal, this mutual goal, as fast as possible. Now, from my modest, let's say, opinion, I think maybe in the future, what in the future lies is if we could bring artificial neural networks and active inference, which are like these two major models of the brain, it would make sense to make like this next level or optimal artificial intelligence. That's my opinion. And I think some scientists are already starting doing this. Because why? Neural networks, they're good for specialized tasks, while active inference is very generalizable. It's very flexible. So it can adapt. And this is what we need, actually. In this kind of an interactive setting, we need something that will adapt. So yeah, maybe something that can work your mind a bit. You can think about that and ask me later if you want. And yeah, and the next level, this is something that also some scientists are talking about, is the humans are not just brains. We're also a lot of other these physiological signals that are happening in us, and these signals and these emotional intelligence influence plays a great role in our decision making and learning. It's not just talk, because, for example, there were experimental studies that showed, for example, from Damasio and so on, very known neuroscientists, that, for example, if you have this opinion still that Spock would be a genius, that's wrong. It's Spock from Star Trek, I don't know, who knows. But we have this thinking that if you're completely logical, if you have this reason of just brain, no emotion, that you will be intelligent. No, actually they showed that if you have impairment in your emotional center in the brain, you cannot make good decisions. So actually you need emotion to make rational and good decisions. So yeah, as Rosalind Picard explained in her book, Effective Computing, she says that indeed we would need to implement or introduce this emotional aspect, emotional intelligence, to have this next level of machine intelligence. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you for listening.
And let's see if we have any questions on this. Oh, plenty.
That's amazing.
Let's get a microphone here in the front. Here. Let's start from that side.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. Really good insights, and it's really nice to see this work. I'd like to ask about, I think the last thought that you shared is a very nice provocation of bringing those two things together. But I think one thing that, at least from what I've seen, it has happened in the last couple of years since machine learning has developed, is that we went further away from the brain analogy, right? Like, so we have backpropagation and lots of stuff that from this initial perceptron don't make much sense. So it's still lousily inspired, but right now we follow the path of whatever works and not necessarily keeping the brain analogy, right? Yeah. So my question is a bit on that, like, how, do you think it makes sense to bring back the brain analogy, or if not, how to bridge this thing that we made further away from the brain back to connecting with the brain? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's an excellent question because indeed we moved far away from the first perceptron, of course, and we've been using many like backpropagation or even Bayesian inference within like probabilistic things and so on. But yeah, actually, to be honest, I think that why it didn't work as well is because we just looked at this micro level. We just looked at the hardware. The neurons is the hardware actually, and the cognition and the real learning is, you know, something more. So I think that this is what we've been missing, and it would make more sense than just apply whatever works. So it's my humble opinion. I didn't yet implement it because, well, to be honest, active inference, it appeared, it's a new theory, well, you know, quite recent from 2010. And so it's been implemented in MATLAB, and I used it in MATLAB. And I mean, it can be optimized. The implementation itself is not really optimized. So it has a lot of work to do still. And as the Perceptron had this 20 years of, you know, like winter of AI, nobody used it until better computers and so appeared. So I think maybe active inference will also take 20 or so years, maybe less, 10 years, to, you know, to help people understand and how to implement it efficiently in an optimal way. Yeah. Okay.
The next question, where was it here?
Yeah.
I was wondering, you know, you're making some kind of a model which is to be trained in real time while the person is thinking?
Yes,
okay.
well, what happens typically in BCI, you have training. Yeah, you have the training. And how the training, really good question. So how the training happens is that you have a certain instructions to the user, and you tell him, for example, in this imagine left or right hand. Imagine left, and you imagine left. The machine records it. Imagine right, imagine right. So you're repeating this instruction, this command, 10 minutes. So the machine can calibrate and learn and receive enough training data from you, precisely you, individually you, because your neural impulses are different from everyone. Of course, people are trying to use transfer learning and to say, okay, maybe if I have enough data and I can generalize and I can transfer this learning to this machine so that I can skip this calibration time individually. But it works less well than if it's individual calibration. Yeah. Did I answer?
But it is supposed to be happening after the individual training. After the initial training, it's supposed to be happening all the time.
Yeah, it's happening all the time. So
how do you do? Is it a reinforcement learning or where does the...
okay. Yeah, well, it depends. So sometimes you have, because in BrainComputer Interface, you have so many layers. So you can adapt the filtering part, you can adapt the machine part, you can adapt so many things. So scientists, like what's been happening for the past 10 years, they've been adapting with different methods, not necessarily reinforcement learning. It depends. There have been also reinforcement learning and a lot of stuff. But yeah, the idea was that the machine recalibrates. It's a good vision, understanding again. So the machine needs to recalibrate while the user is using the system. But this recalibration, now we have a lot of difficulties because we don't know at what level it needs to adapt, how fast, because if it's taking too much data, then maybe it will be too easy for the user, and then the person won't learn, because the person also needs to learn how to influence the machine and so on. So it's a very complex, many layers.
Yeah. Does it? Do you have a prototype? Something like.
I mean, yeah, I
working?
mean, I'm not the one who invented BCI. You know, it's been done for.
No,
30,
I mean,
40
isn't
years.
it? Is it a problem that both the decoder and the person are learning? Does it happen to be some kind of a cycle, a loop?
Yes, it's a closed loop, and it's actually one of the major. I mean, it's been going on. Of course, I was working on that. I was working actually really on the aspect of how to help the user to feel more motivated, because the psychological state of the user actually influences enormously in the success of the machine. So yeah, I was like, okay, let me investigate this psychological aspect. And so I was trying to adapt. I was adapting what they would see, you know, what they were interacting with. And I was adapting like the difficulty. And so I was kind of lying to the users that they were performing better than they were, so that they don't get into this frustration. And so once they were more motivated, they were in this flow. I was using this flow state, flow theory, blah, blah. And it appeared that they would have better performance if they were in this positive, optimal state. So yeah, that was one axis of adaptation. This changes of what they interact with. This is, you know, they see this outcome, and they try to understand and to learn and to, you know, be motivated. And the other aspect, of course, yeah, so I used a little bit of like adaptive classifiers, how I did that. No, there were many, many different models and methods. And for example, in LDA, you know, like linear discriminant analysis, or SVM, support vector machine, the simple algorithm of classification. So the idea was to change the hyperplane. So you have the hyperplane, and it separates, for example, these two classes. And then as you have more data coming, it shifts. The data shifts in time. And so basically you need to shift, you need to change and shift your hyperplane, this line separating the two. So that's a simple implementation that helps actually a lot. So that's one of the.
I think we have another question here, and we have to finish. Oh, we have two questions.
So you talked about how our emotions play a big role in making good decisions. And people who have impaired emotional parts of the brain tend to make bad decisions. Can you talk more about that?
Well, actually, I need to remember. Yeah, there is like a lot of talks about how we perceive and how this information from our physiological signals, like this James Lang's theory that started in 50s or something. And he was talking about how not only do we live our emotion, and then this produces, for example, us to sweat and our heartbeat to increase, but also because this information coming to the brain, it's reinforcing our sensation of this emotion. So it's going also backwards. So they were talking about how if we try to, for example, if we're it's a huge topic, but if we're, for example, aware that our fear, for example, increases because of the physiological. So it has both ways. If it increases, then we can maybe just smile or create another physiological reaction that's that's not expected. That we can contrary this emotion that's happening to us. So I mean, I'm becoming a little bit stressed. So
let's go quick with the last two questions.
But we can talk later. I have a lot of stuff to tell you about that.
Actually, partly the question has been answered. So I think someone else.
Yeah, there's another. There's the last question there in the backwards. Yeah.
My stress.
Thank you.
My decision making.
So you said while in the stage of acquisitioning the EEG signals, you said I don't know, it was the frequency range of between 6 and 13 hertz.
Yeah,
let's
16.
say.
Yeah.
And everything aside from that was considered noise. But since the noise is always present and the biggest problem in the signal processing, did you further filter the noise in the frequency range that you chose, or did you put it inside the ML algorithm to?
It was an oversimplification. Actually, yeah. I mean, you can also learn these temporal filters. You can also learn from each individual. So it can also be done. So it can also be adaptive. Yeah, we can, I mean, it depends. Now, if you want just to do a simple BCI, then you just take from 8 to 30 hertz. And this is like this beta and mu, reactions and so on. So you take that. But not only do you perform temporal filtering, you also perform spatial filtering. Because you have a lot of electrodes, and you want to take just only those that are being, let's say, influenced. That we can see there's some change during this activity. But yeah, I mean, there are a lot of methods where you can do this kind of filter bank methods, and there are a lot of things that just do on signal processing and just work on, yeah, so it can be, but the most simple one is just from 8 to 30, yeah. Or if you're, I mean, it depends on the context. If you're working on a workload, or if you're working on a different, like something that involves occipital region or something else, you will take different regions from the brain. Like we'll focus on other electrodes, and you will focus on, again, different frequency ranges. If you're like meditating or something, it's only the alpha waves and so on. So it depends, yeah. But simply, it can work even with just one filter.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Jelena. Jelena Mladenovic was speaking about brain-machine intelligence.